In the 19th century, the world was basically splitting into two teams. You were either industrializing or you were about to be colonized. Today, we're diving into the incredible stories of two nations that tried to make that leap: Egypt under Muhammad Ali and Japan during its famous Meiji Restoration. Now, both of them saw where the world was heading, but only one actually managed to grab the future they wanted. Why? Well, that's the story we're going to unpack right now.
And really, this was the choice. It was that simple. The huge industrial powers in the West were changing the rules of the game for everybody. You either had to adapt, build your own factories, your own modern army, or you were going to get dominated. It was a pretty brutal but very simple equation.
And right here you can see how their paths just split completely. You've got Egypt starting out super ambitious and bold, but then it just runs smack into this wall of outside influence. Then there's Japan, coming out of centuries of total isolation, and it manages to spark its own revolution from the inside. They both wanted the same thing, but they ended up in completely different places.
So let's really set the scene here. The 19th century wasn't just another 100 years on the calendar. It was a massive tipping point for the entire planet. The steam engine, the factory, these things were literally rewriting the definition of power. So if you were a nation outside of the West, your old ways of doing things just weren't going to cut it anymore. The choice was terrifyingly simple. You adapt or you fade away.
And look, this wasn't just about making better trade deals. This was about power, pure and simple. Steamships and modern rifles became the tools of a whole new kind of empire. And for leaders in places like Egypt and Japan, they could see the writing on the wall. They watched as the great power of China was basically humiliated and carved up. And you know they were thinking, that's going to be us next, unless we change everything.
So how did they fight back? Well, what's really important is that both Egypt and Japan knew they couldn't just wait around for change to happen by itself. They didn't have that kind of time. So instead, they decided the government, the state itself, was going to be the engine driving this modernization. This wasn't free market capitalism. This was a top-down, government-led mission to build a brand new economy, and fast.
And if you look at what they were trying to do, their goals were almost identical. Both wanted modern militaries so they could defend themselves. Both desperately wanted economic independence so they could control their own destinies. For Egypt's ruler, Muhammad Ali, it was all about standing on his own 2 feet, free from the crumbling Ottoman Empire. And for Japan, it was a frantic race to avoid becoming the next China.
So what did Egypt's game plan actually look like? Muhammad Ali went all in. The state poured money into building factories for textiles and weapons. The government took complete control of farming to pay for it all. And crucially, he built a kind of economic wall around the country, using something called protective tariffs.
Protectionism was basically Egypt's shield. By slapping heavy taxes on imports, Ali made foreign goods way more expensive. This gave his brand new Egyptian factories a safe space, you know? It allowed them to grow without getting immediately crushed by a flood of cheap stuff coming in from Britain. It was the standard playbook for any country trying to build an industry from scratch. Japan's approach was totally different. It was almost surgical. After being isolated for so long, they didn't just start building things. First, they studied. They sent people all over the world, to the US and Europe, to just observe and learn. They studied everything: technology, government, military tactics. Then they brought all those ideas back home and carefully adapted them to fit Japan's unique culture and needs.
Okay, and here's where we get to the real turning point. Because you can have the best plan in the world, but your country doesn't exist in a bubble. The big, messy game of geopolitics can come in and change everything. And for Egypt and Japan, this one external factor was what made all the difference.
For Egypt, the biggest roadblock wasn't a flaw in their plan. It was the world's #1 superpower, Great Britain. You see, London didn't look at Egypt and see an emerging partner. It saw a threat. A strong, independent Egypt was sitting right on the main route to India, which was the absolute crown jewel of the British Empire. And that was a threat they just could not allow.
This timeline lays it all out. Just as Muhammad Ali's industrial projects are really starting to take off, a war with the Ottoman Empire gives Britain the perfect excuse to get involved. They stepped in, and the price for their help was forcing Egypt to tear down that economic shield. They made Egypt get rid of its protective tariffs, leaving its new industries totally exposed.
Now, Japan's wake-up call was just as shocking, but the result was so different. When U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed his modern warships into Tokyo Bay in 1853, it sent a shockwave through the country. And this detail about the white flag, wow, it was an unmistakable, not-so-subtle threat. Open your country for trade, or we'll be using these cannons.
But here's the thing. Japan's response wasn't to give in. It was to completely revolutionize their society. The Meiji Restoration was a radical, top-to-bottom overhaul of everything, and it was all driven by one single goal: get strong enough, fast enough to keep the foreigners out. They looked at the threat and decided, okay, we're going to become the threat.
So let's recap. We've got two nations, right? Both facing similar pressures from the West, both with similar dreams of state-led modernization. But by the time the 20th century rolled around, their futures couldn't look more different. So let's really break down why one of these paths led to incredible success and the other to failure.
I mean, the results here speak for themselves. By 1900, Egypt's industrial dream was over. It was basically just an exporter of raw materials, completely dependent on Britain. Japan, on the other hand, had built a world-class industrial base, had become a real military power, and could sit at the table and negotiate with the West as an equal.
So after Britain forced Egypt's markets open, the country was pushed back into just growing cotton for British factories. It became a small cog in someone else's giant industrial machine. But Japan, because it was free from that kind of direct interference, got to build its own industrial machine, and it achieved the very economic freedom that Egypt had lost.
When you boil it all down, it really comes to this. Egypt's modernization project was basically sabotaged from the outside by a superpower that couldn't let it succeed. Japan faced that same pressure from the outside, but somehow it managed to turn that threat into the fuel it needed for a massive internal revolution, one that saved its independence.
And that just leaves us with this huge question to think about, right? How much of a nation's destiny is actually in its own hands, and how much of it is decided by the bigger, more powerful countries in the global system? This tale of two modernizers from the 19th century shows us that it takes both incredible internal will and the right external circumstances to succeed.